instead, trying to do yourselves a piece of lava on the moon, work on that for a while, pat down, and then you can kind of think about thinking, think about the nature of selfhood, which, you know, you could say that Fichte's an early process thinker. He's not thinking nature as process. He's not really a thinker of nature, but he's thinking the self as process. The I, not as a thing, as a substance, but as an act. If we don't will selfhood, then we don't have it. The I is an activity. We don't, whenever we engage in this activity of seeking after the self, we don't want to prematurely come up short and think we've arrived at the self, because that's just another object. So Fichte is constantly trying to remind his readers, his students, to keep striving. That what the I is a kind of infinite striving. And for Fichte, this is what's most important about human life. It's out of that striving that everything emerges, including the natural world. Fichte, unlike Kant, doesn't want to say that there's a new world out there that we can't reach. He wants to say that when we're striving to realize ourselves, we're actually engaging in the creative process that brings forth the world around us. And that maybe we don't fully know nature yet. We're still striving to know it. But really for Fichte, striving to know nature means striving to make nature. And that the human project on the earth is ultimately one of engaging in this remaking of the planet, such that finally, when we've hypothetically reached the end of this infinite striving, if we could reach the end of it, then the earth, the physical world, would be so as to just facilitate human freedom. There'd be no limitations to human freedom when we finish this project of infinite striving, because we would have transformed the earth into our own image, basically. We made the earth full of objects, nature, into ourselves. So, I don't know if you've thought about the implications here, but it's pretty clear that our civilization has sort of followed this Fichtean track, and that we've, instead of trying to understand nature as it might be independently of ourselves, or at least giving it some kind of autonomy, we've instead dismissed the idea of understanding, and instead just tried to transform nature through technology, through extensions of our own striving into the world, to remake it in such a way that it lines up more with our own desire for human freedom. So we've completely transformed the environment around us. Everything around us is now made by human hands, or by machines made by human hands that make other things. So Fichte's vision of the human being is kind of worn out. And industrial growth society is kind of the 200 years later, the result that we get from his kind of philosophy. So he's a profound thinker, don't get me wrong, but the implications of where his ideas lead in thinking of nature only as a projection of human mind, I think leads us to a troubling place. So Schelling, then, was a disciple of Fichte's for several years. Schelling went to seminary as a 15-year-old, several years earlier than most of the other students there. He was roommates at seminary with Hegel and Holderlin, who were both 5 years older than him. Hegel and Holderlin at that point, when Schelling was 15, 16, and they were 20, they were both looking up to Schelling. They were both learning from Schelling. He was just really precocious. His dad was a famous scholar of a religious scholar of ancient languages, and Schelling was reading Leibniz in Latin when he was like 12 or something. So he'd already mastered Greek, and he was always in school with people way older than him, and they were still learning from him. So around 1795, he starts to publish some of his first essays, basically building on Fichte's work. And finally, he is introduced to Goethe as a result of being in contact with Fichte, exchanging letters, and with the Schlegel brothers. And Goethe invites him to Vienna. Schelling then shares some of the work that he's been doing on the philosophy of nature with Goethe. And at first, Goethe's not so impressed. Schelling goes back and writes a new essay dealing with, kind of post-Kantian philosophy of nature, where we can, Schelling says, through a special kind of empiricism or intuitive understanding or intellectual intuition, we can know how nature organizes itself. We can actually gain real knowledge of nature. Scientific genius is possible. So he's sharing these ideas with Goethe, and Goethe's saying, yes, you're right, I do this. Goethe was studying plants at the same time that Kant was writing his Critique of Judgment around 1789, 1790. And Goethe was claiming to have been able to perceive the form or the idea or the archetype that's at work in the metamorphosis of a plant, from seed to stem and leaves to bud, flower, fruit, back to seed again. Goethe said he was actually seeing the way that form metamorphosed through those various stages. And as far as Kant was concerned, that should be impossible. But here's Goethe, mostly known as an artist and a poet, and claiming his artistic sensitivity to natural forms, and being able to perceive more deeply than Kant could. Kant didn't really leave open the possibility that one could develop higher organs of perception, and that the form of sensory experience that we're all born with is not necessarily as good as it gets. That we can continue to develop our perception until it breaks through this limit that Kant thought we have to respect. So Schelling and Goethe are conversing about these works on the philosophy of nature. And finally, Goethe intervenes, and Goethe was a high government official, and he basically said, Schelling, you need to be at Vienna as a professor. I know you're only 23, but you're smarter than me, so go and teach us the theory underlying. Because Goethe wasn't a philosopher. He didn't actually know how to explain what he was doing. He was just doing it. And he was trying to look to these philosophers to help him understand what his method was and how it was possible that he could perceive ideas. And Schelling was helping him to do that. So if with Fichte, you get this movement following upon Kant to absolutize the ego, and to say that nature is just a projection of the mind, and in order to, the point is not to understand nature, it's to kind of overcome nature, or to transform nature into ourselves. That's Fichte's project. Schelling wants to reverse that, and instead, by breaking through the Kantian limits of what we're capable of knowing about nature, by appealing to feeling, I think, Brian, you were saying earlier, that it's through feeling, intuition, that we really gain knowledge. Schelling wants to pursue that path instead of the more austere, removed, distancing from our experience of being embodied and having currents of emotion and feeling flowing through us. Schelling wants to move closer to that and see if we can devise another way of knowing than what Kant thought was possible. And so if
if Kant's question and Fichte's question was, what must the mind be like such that our experience of nature is as it is? What must the structure of the mind be like such that nature appears as it does? That was Kant and Fichte's question. Schelling asks, what must nature be like such that mind is possible, such that mind could have emerged from it? So, he knows that all of the natural scientists like Galileo and Newton pretty much conceived of nature as a machine. He knows that if that's the case, then mind shouldn't be possible. And one of the reasons he's asking this question, what is nature such that mind is possible, is that right around 1800, as he's thinking about this question, geology is coming into its own. We're starting to understand that the earth is far more ancient than the Bible had taught. And we're also starting to understand the evolutionary process of life. Darwin wouldn't come along and publish his theory of the origin of species until 50 or 60 years later, but this idea was already floating around. It's not like Darwin just came up with it out of nowhere. This book here, The Romantic Conception of Life by Robert Richards, he convincingly shows that actually one of Darwin's major influences was Alexander von Humboldt, famous German cosmologist and scientist, and that Humboldt was one of the most steadfast defenders of Schelling's romantic philosophy of nature. So there's actually a romantic Darwin that our Anglo-American culture doesn't usually
Who's the author of that book?
emphasize. Robert Richards.
As an aside, Kant and Fichte wouldn't be considered romantic at all, would they?
Fichte was definitely at the center of the romantic circle, but I wouldn't call him a romantic, because one of the things that the romantics, like Schelling and Novalis and the Schlegel brothers emphasized, was the need to kind of systematicity is important, but we also need to make room for creative play and open-endedness and life.
It doesn't sound like Kant.
Or Fichte. Fichte and Kant were both very systematic, very discursive. They didn't want to let creativity and imagination have too much of a free rein. They wanted to keep those things sort of strapped down so that just through rigorous reasoning and logic we could arrive at a systematic conception of things. That's more where Kant and Fichte were coming from, which is not at all where the Romantics were coming from. They wanted to glorify feeling and imagination. Not at the expense of system. Most of them wanted to have both, which we'll see when we move into the Schlegel brothers and the Wallace. Is there another question? So Schelling's philosophy of nature then, and asking what must nature be like since the mind is possible, he ends up basically postulating that nature is a kind of organism. The whole of nature can be understood as a living creature. He says that the ancients referred to this as the world soul. I'll read a quote to you where he describes what his world soul is like. So he says, in one of his books on the philosophy of nature, he says that two conflicting forces conceived at the same time in conflict and in unity lead to the idea of an organizing principle, forming the world into a system. Perhaps the ancients wished to intimate this with their idea of the world soul. So, in order to understand what nature must be like, such that mind is possible, Schelling posits these two infinite forces. One infinite force wants to expand out, radiate out infinitely. The other wants to retreat and withdraw and limit itself infinitely. So these two opposed forces, each of them is infinite. The reason he needs two is if there was only one infinite force, it's as if everything, the whole evolutionary process of nature would just unfurl itself at once, in an instant, and nothing would be able to actually happen. So he needs an opposing force to check it, to limit it. And these forces are never exactly in equilibrium, which is why they don't just cancel each other out. This is very similar to the idea that modern cosmologists talk about, the way that at the Big Bang, the fluctuation between matter and antimatter that constitutes the nature of the quantum vacuum somehow fell out of equilibrium, so that some matter survived the annihilation of antimatter, and from that little bit of matter that survived, the universe was born. So for whatever reason, there's this disequilibrium that allows these infinite forces to begin to sort of duel with one another, and they're both, as he says, they're in conflict, dueling, but they're also in unity. They're not, this isn't a dualism, this is a polarity. It's a creative polarity. And Schelling describes a whole series of stages that nature moves through as these opposed infinite forces, duel with each other. And that as they arrive at these different stages of temporary equilibrium, new forms of life emerge. So you can think of, minerals as the first, like matter itself, or the mineral realm, as the first sort of truce declared between these two forces. But they weren't finished yet. They kept dueling. Plants emerged. They weren't finished. They kept dueling. Animals emerged. And then, eventually, human consciousness emerged. And for Schelling, consciousness is an expression of nature. It's what he says is that it's the highest potency of nature. It's nature at the point where it can reflect upon itself. So what he says then is that philosophy is nothing other than a natural history of our mind. He says, what in us knows is the same as what is known. So in other words, for Schelling, the whole goal of philosophy is to become nature itself philosophizing. And he says that when we look around and perceive the sort of mechanical causality playing out, the exchange of causes and effects which result, we're only seeing an appearance. And what's really going on is this universal organization. So the way he puts it is that viewed from the height of nature's fundamental organization, viewed from the perspective of the world soul, in other words, the particular successions of causes and effects that delude us with the appearance of mechanism disappear as infinitely small straight lines in the universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists.
I would say the last few words.
In which the world itself persists. Let me read it again. Viewed from the height of nature's fundamental organization, the particular successions of causes and effects that delude us with the appearance of mechanism disappear as infinitely small straight lines in the universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists.
Where can we find it?
This is in introduction to the first system of the philosophy of nature. If you guys want to know where any of the quotes come from, some of them I didn't write it down, I was just taking notes last night. Email me and I'll find it for you. You can also just Google a part of this now. Any section of these quotes, Google it and you'll know exactly where it came from. So here's another quote to give you a sense for how Schelling thinks of nature. Now, if Fichte was one of the first process philosophers of the self, Schelling was one of the first process philosophers of nature. So here's an example of that. He says, a stream flows in a straight line forward as long as it encounters no resistance. Where there is resistance, a whirlpool forms. Every original product of nature is such a whirlpool. Every organism is such a whirlpool. The whirlpool is not something immobilized. It is rather something constantly transforming, but reproduced anew at each moment. Thus, no product in nature is fixed, but it is reproduced at each instant through the force of nature entire. So, as a process thinker then, the problem for Schelling is no longer how to explain change. He assumes change in process, that all of nature is this ongoing self-organizing process. And the problem then becomes, how do you explain stasis? How do you explain the fact that there are these individual organisms? And so the image he wants us to imagine is that organisms aren't these self-subsisting, separated entities, but actually from the perspective that he's asking us to take, which is that of the world soul, the universal organizing principle of the universe, that organism actually plugs into this wider system of circulating organizing powers, like a whirlpool plugs into the flowing of the stream. It's not a separate entity. If that stream stopped flowing for a second, the whirlpool, which seems so distinct and autonomous, would just disappear. So while we're on Schelling, let's talk a little bit about his wife, Carolyn. Carolyn Belma Schlegel Schelling was a really amazing woman. She, when was she born? She was born in 1763, so she was 12 years older than Schelling. Her first husband was a doctor that Carolyn's father sort of forced her to marry. She hated it. She was forced to be, more domestic woman at home, raising the kids, doing the dishes, cleaning the house, and that was not who she was. So, lucky for her, in her own words, she said she was thrilled when her first husband died. She was free. This was right around the time of the French Revolution. And what did she do? She immediately went to a border city next to France where the Germans in that city, Mainz, I think it was called. And she fell in love with a French revolutionary who was over there trying to wake the Germans up to what was happening in France and tell them to throw off their chains and organize a new democratic republic in this city. And this fellow's name, this Frenchman, his name was Georg, I guess, Forster. Sounds English, but it's French, apparently. He, when he was 18, he traveled with Captain Cook into the Pacific. And he wrote this book recounting his experiences, which was very influential in Europe. Influenced Alexander von Humboldt, who then went on his own journey across the world, and then wrote his own book, which was also the model for Darwin and his journey on the Beagle. So you can see that this idea was repeated. It started with this fellow Forster. So anyways, they fall in love. She gets pregnant with his child in the midst of this revolutionary activity in Mainz on the border with France, and the French declare war on Germany, and Germany declares war on France, and a battle takes place, and Goethe's on the front lines carrying his theory of colors with him as he's still working on it. Luckily, he doesn't get shot. Unfortunately, lots of young German and French soldiers did die. The French won this battle. The city of Mainz did not get liberated by the revolutionaries who were there. Carolyn was locked in prison with her daughter, August. And it's when she was in prison that she discovered she was pregnant. Now, she got out of prison because she was friends with the older Schlegel brother, Wilhelm, who pulled some strings and was able to get her released under his protection. She felt indebted to him. I don't know that she was ever really in love with him, but he was head over heels for her, as was Wilhelm's brother, Friedrich Schlegel. And she maybe had more of a thing for Friedrich, but he was too young, and so she ended up marrying Wilhelm. And, you know, through the Schlegels got brought into this romantic circle where, you know, Goethe was hanging out, Schelling was hanging out, Wallace, Holderlin, Hegel, Schiller, Fichte, and she was really intellectually engaged with their ideas. She was right there with them in all of these conversations they were having when they would have parties at the Schlegel's house in Jena. And really, I think it's probably safe to say that what made all of the romantics, what kept them more in touch with feeling, with the aesthetic dimension of reality, with emotion, with relationship, and so on, was in large part her influence. Certainly, I can say this for sure about her influence on Schelling. So, her and Wilhelm Schlegel were married for 7 or 8 years, but Wilhelm had to leave town for a while, and Carolyn, she just fell absolutely in love with Schelling, who was, again, 12 years younger than her. Schelling was actually in love with her daughter at first. They went on a journey to some natural hot springs somewhere in Germany because the younger daughter, August, she got sick, and so they wanted to go on a little vacation and let her recoup a bit. Unfortunately, she died. Carolyn had many children, 3 or 4 kids before August, and they all died too, very young. So it was just another tragedy for her and for Schelling and the whole romantic circle. Schelling was actually, at this point, practicing his own form of medicine that he derived from his understanding of nature as a giant organism. And he was accused by others of being responsible for her death. They said that he changed the prescription that another doctor had given her, and that if he had just kept it the same, she would survive. But that other doctor said, no, she was going to die. But just to show you what kind of guy that Wilhelm Schlegel was, even though he knew, Carolyn had told him at this point, hey, I've never loved anyone like I love Schelling. I want to be with Schelling. Despite the fact that Schelling kind of ended his marriage, Wilhelm published a letter clearing Schelling of any wrongdoing in the death of August. And then he had Goethe arrange for a divorce, which back then is kind of a big deal to have a divorce. Carolyn was quite a scandal as far as most traditional Germans were concerned, because she had 3 separate marriages, right? Kids out of wedlock with other men and stuff. So she was a real revolutionary. So Goethe arranged for the divorce. Carolyn and Schelling got married around 1801 or 1802, while Schelling was still a professor at Jena. And they had, as far as I can tell from reading some of the letters that they exchanged with others, a really great marriage. And then unfortunately in 1809, while Schelling was in the midst of one of, actually the last book that he ever published, was called Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom. Carolyn got dysentery, I think, and she died. After that, Schelling wrote in a letter to a friend, he says, I now need friends who are not strangers to the real seriousness of pain, and who feel that the single right and happy state of the soul is the divine mourning in which all earthly pain is immersed. So after Carolyn died, he never published another book. He kept writing, he kept lecturing, but he could never finish a project. And his philosophy took a distinctly tragic turn. Tragic in the sense of, form of drama, tragedy. He looked at nature, human history as, in a sense, still a beautiful story, but a tragic story. The beauty emerged from that bitter, sweet experience of tragedy. So he lived until 1854. He outlived all of these guys. Hegel died in 1831, you see. Hegel, Schelling lived until 1854. And so according to Hegel's own theory of the historical progression of philosophy to a series of systems that seem true until they reach their limits and then become false as the next person picks up where the last guy left off. According to Hegel's own theory about that, Schelling outlived him and got the last word, so Schelling should be at the end of this progression, if Hegel's right about this version of the story, which I don't think we need to assume that that's the only version of the story we can tell. But before we move on to Hegel, I want to say a little bit about the very similar philosophical ideas of Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel. So Friedrich, he was born 1772, I think. (1772 to 1829), so he's just 3 years older than Schelling. He also was a professor at Jena University, and he's usually thought of nowadays as more of a literary critic than a philosopher, although more recently he's being reinterpreted as a very serious philosophical thinker. In particular, this book by Dali and Nasser, The Romantic Absolute, tries to reconstruct not only Schlegel's philosophy, but Novalis' philosophy, because both of them were thought of more as poets, literary artists. And she wants to say, no, they were actually doing real philosophy. One of the reasons they're conceived of nowadays as more as artists or involved in literature or lit crit today is because, again, of Hegel's judgment, Hegel's version of the history of philosophy, where he kind of dismissed Schlegel as nothing but an ironist. All of his writing was ironic, and it was meant just to create enjoyable sensations in its readers, but that Schlegel didn't actually have a serious philosophy. That was Hegel's point of view. So he just dismissed Schlegel and didn't acknowledge that many of Schlegel's ideas, particularly regarding the importance of history in philosophy, came from Schlegel. So, for example, Schlegel says, philosophy must be thoroughly historical. Our philosophy is itself history. And Schelling agreed with Schlegel, but Schlegel criticized Schelling